The basic 3 checkpoints we use to test the validity of any rational argument are actually universal to all rational arguments, regardless of the topic a respective argument is addressing. So, for example, if I presented an argument concerning the status of a fetus, you would test the validity of this argument by seeing if it can pass the same 3 checkpoints that you would use to test the validity of an argument concerning the existence or lack thereof of God. So, these checkpoints are actually pretty simple and easy to memorize. You have the semantic checkpoint, the validity checkpoint, and the necessity checkpoint. And each is equally important, because if your argument fails to pass any one of these, it is invalid, 100%. It is not as though if you fail to pass the semantic checkpoint, your argument is 50% invalid. If you fail to pass the validity checkpoint, your argument is 75% invalid. And if you fail to pass the necessity checkpoint, your argument is 100% invalid. No. If you fail to pass any one of these checkpoints, your argument is 100% invalid, which does not necessarily mean that the conclusion is wrong, only that you have not yet presented an argument that would lead us to accept the conclusion. So, the first checkpoint we tend to scoff at, and we tend to treat as irrelevant or at very least negligible. So if we presented an argument and someone responded by semantically deconstructing it, we would say, well, I'm not going to get into a semantic argument. But as Orwell will tell you, semantics are actually quite important. In this checkpoint, you make sure that you have properly defined your terms, that you are using them properly, and that you are not using them ambiguously, and that you and the other individual in the debate are agreeing on your definition. If you used a word with multiple meanings and then you were using those meanings interchangeably with the same word from one step of your argument to the next, it would offset the validity of your conclusion. For example, let's say that the term we have not properly defined is Bob. It is a name of an individual. So my first premise may be something that we can accept, like, if you murder someone, you are a murderer. Okay. The second premise may be that Bob murdered somebody, and we can accept this as valid and say that yes, Bob did indeed murder somebody. But if in my conclusion I say Bob is therefore a murderer, and I'm talking about a different individual who just happens to be named Bob, my conclusion is invalid, my argument is invalid, because just because Bob 1 murdered somebody does not mean that Bob 2 is a murderer. Now, if Bob 2 also happened to murder somebody, then yes, he's a murderer. So the conclusion is not necessarily proven false, but the argument is proven invalid. And so it is, again, much easier to demonstrate that an argument is invalid than it is to demonstrate that an argument is valid. To demonstrate that an argument is valid, you must pass all 3 checkpoints. To demonstrate that it is invalid, you must only show that it fails to pass any one or any combination of these checkpoints. Easier to prove invalid. Now, not easier to prove negative. I can't necessarily prove that Bob 2 is not a murderer, but I can prove that you have failed to provide a reason to label him as such. Now, the second premise is the validity premise, and this is pretty obvious. Essentially, it tests to see if your premise, or the second checkpoint is the validity checkpoint, and it tests to see if your premise is valid. Big surprise there. So, for example, if premise 1 was that Mary is a dog, let's accept that Mary's a dog, and premise 2 was that all dogs have 4 legs, it would necessarily follow that if A and B, then C, Mary has 4 legs. But I can empirically demonstrate that premise 2, all dogs have 4 legs, is not true. Not all dogs have 4 legs. I can go out and pick up a dog that's been hit by a car and has 3 legs and say, look at this mutt, it's got 3 legs. Not all dogs have 4 legs. Therefore, while Mary probably has 4 legs, it's not necessarily true that she has 4 legs, so I don't have to accept your conclusion. I can escape the conclusion of your argument, and your argument is invalid. Now, the final checkpoint is no more important than any other checkpoint, but it is harder to pass. This is the checkpoint by which you test to see if your conclusion necessarily follows your premise. Now, if I presented an argument, for example, that says, I am the king of Rome, therefore I am above grammar, the premise is I am the king of Rome. It does not necessarily follow that I am above grammar. However, if I presented the argument that A is a part of B and B is a part of C, the conclusion that A is a part of C does necessarily follow. So that argument would, as long as I properly defined each of my terms, and as long as it was true that A is a part of B and B is a part of C, be a valid argument because it now passes all 3 checkpoints. Let's say that A is the brick in a wall, B, which is a part of a house, C. A is a part of C because A is a part of the wall, B, which is a part of the house, C. And a part of a part is a part of the whole, just not as big of a part as the part that it is a part of. And that's all very tedious and redundant, but I think that the illustration makes the argument very clear. So these are the 3 basic checkpoints with which you test the validity of any rational argument. Next time you get into a debate, try to use these. It's a good exercise and it is good logical practice. Remember, semantics, validity, necessity. And thank you for watching my video. I hope you found it enlightening.